So my power decided to flicker off and on as I'm recording a video about a spooky game, and if that isn't an omen, I don't know what is. What's up everyone, it's Sinistry, and for this spooky season, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite horror games and how it really defines the rules of a good horror game, and that game is Inscryption. Horror is a huge genre, and there are so many different types of games for all kinds of players, but in my opinion, Inscryption really does the best job of capturing the horror elements in their purest form in the best way possible to give players a truly spooky experience without being too reliant on some cheap tricks. Now, if you haven't played Inscryption, don't worry because I'm only going to be including some very minor spoilers, mostly about the structure of the game, nothing really involving the plot points or anything like that. So if you haven't played it, you are probably safe to watch this video, but if you want to go in blind, totally get it, just come back once you've finished. Also, make sure to subscribe if you like gaming analysis content. I recently hit 100 subscribers, which I'm super excited about, and I can't wait to put out more content for all of y'all. But with that being said, let's quickly dive into what Inscryption is, and then talk about the 3 rules of horror. Inscryption is a 2021 game developed by Daniel Mullins Games and published by Devolver Digital. It's a deck-building roguelite game with some escape room elements, and it's divided into 3 major acts. Now, all of the acts are kind of cohesive in terms of the gameplay, but each act kind of tells a different part of the story, and it's a very long and very kind of drawn-out story, but in the best way possible. Horror may not be considered Inscryption's primary genre, but if you've played this game, you totally get what I'm saying when I say this is a pure example of a horror game. It's so spooky, so scary, and there's so much to love about it, and that's why I have kind of developed these 3 rules that make up such a good horror game based off of the formula that Inscryption has relied on. And the first rule is cultivate fear, because you can't really have horror without a scary element. Now, some games might rely on things like jump scares to make you afraid, but in my opinion, it's not actually as effective as what Inscryption does, which is creating a very tense atmosphere with a lot of eerie elements that remind you that it is a horror game, and kind of builds up that anticipation as you wait for a major payoff. One of the best elements of Inscryption is its first act location, which is the cabin in the woods. Everybody's familiar with the trope of going to the cabin in the woods and either encountering a serial killer or a cult or something demonic, something's always happening in the woods. And you are definitely afraid as you sit in this cabin with someone you can't see because they are obscured by a black void, and all you can see is their eyes, and you see all of the weird things that are along the walls, and you are playing this very twisted game of D&D with this crazy game master. The cabin definitely is kind of its own character. There's so much to explore within it. All of the escape room puzzles are super fun, and I love how it kind of feels like it's constantly evolving as you progress through the first act of the game. In addition to the cabin, Leshy, who is the mysterious person that you are playing with at the beginning of the game, is his own character for sure. He's kind of wild. He is very spooky at first when you don't really know anything about him and you don't see him. And then as he plays up the different characters, you're wondering what's wrong with this guy because he's getting way too into this for it to be healthy. However, there's another element that's also really scary. What happens when you die? Well, that is kind of the major buildup of Act 1 in my opinion, at least for the first part of Act 1. And the first time you die, it is definitely scary as you are snatched out of your chair and you are dragged into some random room where you wake up and you're like, where the heck am I? And this dude is just like, here, write some things down on a card and then let me take your picture. And then you are turned into a card. And then you respawn. It's very weird. Act 1 is just a very strange time. I honestly really love it, and I know a lot of people felt like Act 1 was kind of a nice contained story in and of itself, but I'm really happy that there was even more to the game after Act 1, because the fear that's cultivated in Act 1 is definitely carried over into the other acts, as you felt like you had a total story done, and then you come to find out that you didn't, so you're like, what is even gonna come next? But suffice it to say, Act 1 and kind of the game overall does a really good job of cultivating that fear in its audience, so you never really know what to expect and you're always expecting something to come right around the corner. However, for all of the setup that cultivates fear, you can't really have a great horror game if you don't have rule number 2, which is make it believable. Now I hear what you're saying. There are so many different games or shows or movies out there that are really great pieces of horror but aren't believable at all. But let me ask you this, is it actually scary? Or is it just a really fun time? Because that's also totally valid. You can have fun with pieces of media that just aren't scary but are still considered horror. Something like Evil Dead comes to mind, where it's not really all that scary, but it's still considered a piece of horror, and it's still a classic, and people love it, and that's fine. But I'm talking specifically today about actually scary pieces of media. So in my opinion, if you want something to be scary, you have to have some level of believability in it, so that way audiences can kind of suspend their disbelief and still believe that this could happen to them. Gaming is a really great medium for suspending your disbelief and having a believable kind of story because you're already engaging in the story itself. You don't have to imagine yourself as a protagonist if you already are the protagonist. So that already is a +1 to Inscryption, but Inscryption does a really great job of being believable through other means. As I said, the cabin setting is definitely a very believable trope. It is something that's used throughout all kinds of media because it's very believable. I mean, if you haven't been to a cabin in the woods, you might know somebody who has, or you can at least envision yourself maybe going on a vacation to a cabin, so it's not that far-fetched. And then likewise, Leshy being just a really hardcore DM is very believable. I mean, we all have that one friend who just goes a little too hard for their hobby, and that is definitely Leshy, so again, it doesn't feel that far-fetched. Although there are magical elements to the game, it doesn't really feel that outlandish because you don't really feel like the magic is the major component of the story. And I feel like that can be said with other forms of media as well, where you would see like a magical story or maybe like aliens or something else happening that just isn't really super believable, but you can suspend your disbelief enough because it feels like if you were in this world that's very similar to ours already, then it would be within the realm of possibility. However, as you kind of go through Inscryption, in my opinion, there are a couple other things that really ground the game. So the found footage aspect, which I won't really spoil more about, I'll just mention that there is found footage aspects in this game. It is very believable because we have like YouTube series, like creepypasta series that kind of play on that found footage trope. You also have things like Blair Witch. So this is something that we've seen throughout media. It's not really a new format, but seeing it in a game definitely kind of takes you into this world and makes it feel like it's a very realistic world. Although Act 2 does kind of take me out due to the change in the art style and a little bit of the tonal shift, I feel like Act 3 actually pulls me right back in as it becomes a little more realistic with its art style, and it doesn't really feel that far off from what our world is. It kind of feels like this is something that could actually happen to us. So all of these elements together really make Inscryption feel like it is a believable game, which adds to that level of horror, that level of fear. As we progress through the story, we don't really know what's going to happen, but we can believe that whatever it is, it's something that could happen in real life. Now that we have rules 1 and 2, let's be real, they are great for setting up a story, but they aren't really enough to kind of create a horror game. And that's because you really need rule number 3, which is subvert expectations. Horror is at its best when it's subverting our expectations and catching us off guard, because there's nothing really scarier than being told that what you believed is all a lie and you never knew anything all along. Subverting expectations is the best way to create lasting impact with a piece of horror, because in my opinion, if you think about all of the different pieces of media that you've ever consumed in the horror genre, you definitely are first thinking of the ones that had like a plot twist that really hooked you. It's probably toward the end of the movie and you're like, oh my gosh, that is never going to leave my mind. That's the first thing I think about when I think of great horror. And it's the same way with games. You're just always waiting for that one plot twist, that one subversion that's going to really make this a masterful piece of horror. Now that being said, it can be kind of hard if you're not familiar with subverting expectations, that kind of trope, to understand what is subverting expectations and what isn't. So let me quickly break down what that is, and then we'll talk about how Inscryption does a great job of handling subversions throughout the entire game. The first way to subvert our expectations is by foreshadowing a twist. So twists are great, but if they're not foreshadowed, there's not much payoff. It's really good when there was a tidbit dropped earlier on in a game or in a movie that then pays off later on that you kind of forgot about the whole time, and then when it happens, you're like, oh my gosh, I totally see how that could happen. It just gets our brain kind of working and makes us always question the things that we're watching, which again is super engaging for a piece of horror. And like I said about questioning things, questioning our own beliefs is another major factor of subverting expectations. So this could be, for example, using an unreliable narrator. So if you're showing everything from the perspective of one character, and that character has something going on that makes it so they're not showing the full truth, then that can definitely subvert our expectations as we come to terms with what reality actually is. Furthermore, unraveling deeper lore is a really great way of subverting expectations, where maybe you thought a story was self-contained and you find out that there's even more under the surface that you didn't uncover, and that can lead to some really clever tonal shifts. And tonal shifts are another great way of subverting expectations by kind of playing around with the stereotypical plot structure of a story. So those are the things that subverting expectations could include, but some things that can't include are, in my opinion, jump scares. I just have to say jump scares. I really dislike them. They are not subverting your expectations. They are often very predictable, and they're not really scary. They are just startling, and startling, again, is not the same as scaring someone. So I really don't like jump scares, and I feel like if you want to subvert people's expectations, set up a jump scare and then don't have one. Another plot point which you see in a lot of really bad horror is introducing a villain in the third act. So you might have like a fake villain early on, or you might have no villain early on, and then they're only introduced at the very end as things are kind of starting to resolve, or it seems like they're going to resolve, and then out of nowhere some random person comes through and is like, I was doing it all along. But there was no hint to it, so you're like, where did you come from? I never could have guessed this. And that's kind of the point of subverting expectations, is that the plot points should be guessable, or at least clever. Whereas, entering a villain at the very end of a story who never had any setup just feels very cheap and just feels like random, like there wasn't really any purpose to the plot. Additionally, gore for the sake of it is not subverting expectations. There can be some really clever ways to use gore, as in Inscryption, but just gore for the sake of it is just gore. It's just blood and guts and other things, and that's not really scary in and of itself. It can be gross, but gross is also not equal to scary. But now that we know what are effective subversions of expectations and what are not subversions, let's talk about how Inscryption cleverly handles subversions to keep us entertained the entire time. First of all, making the cards that we're building our deck out of actual living beings is really ingenious. There are so many deck building games out there, and if you've ever played one, you probably never gave a second thought to whatever's on the card. You might think the art looks cool or it has a great power, but you're not really thinking about it as an actual being. And Inscryption says you definitely should be doing that, because every time you sacrifice a card, yeah, you're killing that being. And every time you stitch up a card or you give a sigil to another card, you're taking something from someone and giving it to someone else. And that's kind of crazy if you think about it. It's even more crazy when you consider that every time you die, you're turned into a card. So instead of it just being like a life system like in so many different games, you're essentially being reborn every single time into this super scary game, and you have to eventually contend with possibly sacrificing yourself, or maybe using your own card, or doing weird things with your past selves. It just gets kind of meta and is very weird, and that's part of what makes Inscryption so cool. Additionally, there is some body horror in Inscryption, which is kind of gross. I'm fine with it, but if you are a little bit sensitive to body horror, you might find it to be a little bit iffy. I would say it's very inspired by things like Saw, so if you can handle something like a Saw movie, you're probably going to be fine. Another thing I mentioned is that Act 1 is not the end of the game, even though it very much feels like it could be. And a lot of people would be very happy if Act 1 was the end. Like, if that was the only game, it would still be a fine game. But the fact that it isn't is just a clever subversion, as it builds up to us fighting this big bad guy finally defeating Leshy, and then we find out, yeah, you're not even close to being done with this game. Another thing that happens in Act 1 is finding the found footage, which again, I won't really go into all of that because that's kind of lore of the game, but the found footage component is a little startling when you come across it. You're like, what is happening here? And as you watch the videos, you're like, wow, this is actually really well thought through, and I could have never guessed the game would go in this direction. And even though I say that, it's not one of those like non-subversions that comes out of nowhere, because there's actually some hints at the very, very, very beginning of the game that this would happen, but you have to really remember the beginning of the game in order to make that connection. And the final two components are the deeper lore as you go throughout the story. Again, you think that Act 1 is the end, but then you find out that there is much, much more that you never even considered that could come about, and it opens a whole new world for you and much more to think about, which ultimately leads to what I would consider to be a twist villain, although it's maybe not a twist villain if you are following the story carefully, if you're paying attention. But if you're just kind of playing casually, or if you haven't played in a while, it definitely can be surprising when you find out who the true villain of the game is. So all of these subversions coming together with the cultivation of fear and the believability of Inscryption really help to make it a perfect game for the horror genre. Horror is a huge genre, and there are so many different games for all different types of players, and even if you're not much of a horror player, you still might find Inscryption to be super fun. I think that the best games out of any kind of subgenre within horror have at least some of these elements as found in Inscryption, but Inscryption itself just does a really great job of breaking down these tropes and building them back up into something new and fresh that I've never seen before. So the next time that you play a horror game, definitely think about these rules and think, how closely does this game fit into all of these different rules? Does it subvert my expectations? Am I feeling afraid or tense or anticipatory throughout the game? And do I feel like this game could really happen to me? Is it believable? And I guarantee if you say yes to all three of these, then you will have a quality horror game on your hands. And if you are kind of new to the horror genre, definitely pick up Inscryption. It is such a fun time. Even though I mentioned a few different spoilery things in this video, you will just encounter so many things that you could have never imagined, and you will have an absolute blast. It's especially good for people who like roguelites like me, so if you like that kind of genre and you want something a little spooky for Halloween, definitely pick up this game. But with that being said, if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm really excited to be putting out some more videos for you guys soon, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.